Hello and welcome to today's SEI webcast, Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management, No Silver Bullet. My name is Shane McGraw, Outreach Team Lead here at the Software Engineering Institute, and I'd like to thank you for attending. We want to make today's webcast as interactive as possible, so we will address questions throughout today's talk, and you can submit them in the YouTube chat area now, and we will get to as many as we can. Our featured speaker today is Brett Tucker. And Brett is the technical manager of cyber risk in the CERT division here at the SEI. He's responsible for a research and development portfolio focused on improving the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure and assets with specific focus on risk management and resilience. Brett is also an adjunct faculty member at the Hines College at CMU. Brett, welcome. Thanks for taking some time to join me today.
Thanks, Shane. It's a pleasure. It's beautiful weather to be here, so why not come inside and talk to you?
Absolutely. So we got to lay the groundwork for today's talk a little bit. We hear a lot about supply chain risk management in the media and other sources. But why is it such a big concern, especially in the world of cybersecurity? Can you lead off with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, supply chain risk and supply chain in general is not a new thing. There's nothing so novel about that. But within recent years, you hear things like SolarWinds and Log4j and these different issues that have kind of cropped up within the community, especially within cybersecurity. And it has really put organizations on notice that, hey, as much as we understand and know what we have in terms of assets in our organization and how they can be threatened, we need to start thinking about those that we depend on most to keep our organizations running. That may be like suppliers who are providing services as much as material or software or applications or anything of that nature. And I think the notable feature of this is that you're seeing it both in the public and private sector. There's a lot of, let's say, noise or a lot of messaging, a lot of different discussions going on in all reaches of the sector on how to better address reduction of risk exposure with a supply chain.
So how does an organization get visibility into their particular supply chain? Where do they need to turn to get that insight?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, let's start at the top, like we should with anything in cybersecurity or in any concern similar to this. It starts at the top in terms of strategy in the organization. And there's this notion that at the highest reaches, and if you're a private organization, you're talking about the executive board, maybe you're talking about executive committees, some level of governance, there is this push that needs to start at the top to set that tone. And that tone at the top should go down through the organization to emphasize the need for professionals to focus more on risk exposure within the supply chain. Okay, so that starts at the very top. And then when you work your way down into the lower reach of the organization, now you start talking about, well, what policies do we have in place? What do we expect of our providers? And what do we expect in terms of them to belly to the bar and demonstrate that we can trust them? And then you start getting into the criteria of that discussion. However, we could get into the little details. It all links back to that strategic idea at the top again. Like, what are we trying to accomplish? Is it trying to make more money? Is it trying to do it in as secure a way as possible? Are we trying to build reputation for our organization? And it all kind of comes back on itself. Let's take reputation, for example, right? Organizations, they want to demonstrate to their customer base that they're delivering products in a manner that will not be disrupted, in a manner that will be safe and secure in the products. Well, if I have an nth tier of suppliers that are fueling that product base, it all goes back to, are those suppliers committed to delivering our products as much as we are and in a safe manner? If in fact one of them should suffer an incident, then their reputation is damaged and it's going to go up the line. It's going to be like a stack of dominoes. So that kind of bounces the idea back up to the executive branches, executive reaches of an organization as to why they should care.
So, and I didn't plan to ask this question, but you talked a lot about executives there, Brett. And I know CMU has executive education through the Hines College. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because
Sure.
how do how do the executives get the training they need now, or the education they need? I know it's somewhat newer there at Heinz College. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's available?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to be somewhat selfish here in terms of
Yeah,
delivering a plug because over Heinz College, which I point my hands because it's over in that general direction,
yeah,
we do have some great executive programs that are discussing and they actually have some very robust curriculum in talking about supply chain risk in a lot of different veins. I'll give you an example. We have at least 3 programs that come to mind that are worth exploring if you want to get that executive take on how to address not just supply chain risk, but all manners of risk. First and foremost, we have a chief risk officer program. Within that program, this is for budding or aspiring people who want to be chief risk officers, or maybe people who are actually in the role. And it is a macroscopic and then actually, I should say, microscopic look too at most issues like supply chain risk, amongst others, and how to establish proper policy, procedure, governance, and appetite in an organization, and how to drive that in an organization that risks are handled in a apples to apples kind of way so that we aren't favoring some over another, an enterprise risk kind of a take. But to go beyond that, we also have the Chief Information Security Officer program, the CISO program, which is also very popular. And it would give you a more cybersecurity specific kind of a take on this now for the budding or aspiring chief information security officers out there, or people who are already in the role. Same idea, right? This is how do we establish proper governance in organizations so that we know that our cybersecurity risks are being addressed properly, that we're putting the proper controls in place, and how are we monitoring and maintaining that security stack. And supply chain, once again, yet another factor that is double down on that program. And finally, I think I should give one more nod. We also have a Chief Information Officer program, CIO program, that does similar. I'm not going to beat that horse dead because I've gone there. You see there's this like recurring theme. And actually, it goes beyond to the answer to this question, the idea of educating these folks. You've heard all these, the CIO, the CISO, the CRO, all of them should be thinking about supply chain in one way or another. So that thread, that silver thread that's going through each of those folks, they should have in their heart, and they walk out of CMU with that, this notion that, hey, supply chain matters, and we should be addressing that risk.
Great, thanks for that, Brett. So let's get into the title of today's talk. We talk about no silver bullet. So it's implying that no one tool or no one process is going to take care of everything. So can you speak to that idea a little bit, and what's needed to secure an organization's supply chain?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, and I think it's human nature that we try to find that one big solution. Can we just pay the check to one thing or one person and just be done with it? And much like any cybersecurity portfolio, any risk portfolio out there, there's got to be more than one solution from a couple of perspectives. One is we want to have that defense in depth nature. In other words, we want to have multiple walls in place. So that way, and by the way, with risk, remember, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. If we have a risk come to fruition, we have that incident, we have multiple layers of protection. That is, A, keeping the risks allayed and keeping them at bay, that they don't happen. And if that cold, dark day does come, that we're prepared. So supply chain risk, in a sense, is no different, because now you're thinking about it not just from your own organization, but from the perspective of those who are providing you critical services. So let's step back and talk about that for a moment. An organization would be keen, and by the way, this is the first step to the no silver bullet, right? First of all, you'd be keen to establish a good asset inventory, understanding not only the people, the information, the technology, facilities that you may have in place that are helping you deliver upon your strategy, but you also need to understand the third-party providers that you have, the supply chain that you have, that also bring their own people, their own facilities, their own information and technology to the table that they're reliant upon. And the idea here is that you want to eliminate that one spot, that one critical asset that if it were deprecated or taken out of service, that it brings your whole organization to a crashing halt. So let's say due care and due diligence for understanding your supply chain is first and foremost. And it goes without saying that it's more than just understanding their assets, it's understanding their threats. So let's go to another part here. If we are effectively deploying and implementing an all-source intelligence kind of environment, that we not only understand the threats to our organization, but we also would cascade down to others to say, hey, you're helping us, you're providing services to us. You need to understand that those threats now be actually looking at you as well. Because we saw this, for example, back in the day with Target, for example, corporation, when they had a hack that came to them through their supply chain. It was actually through an HVAC vendor. And when something like that happens, you don't want to be caught unaware, let's say, right? Now, to go back to that, what do? You have to establish a trust relationship and an exchange of information with your supply base. And this may be done formally. Maybe we have a service level agreement. Maybe we have contractual terms and conditions that are in place that we have established with these providers to make sure they know what the expectations are. But it goes beyond that as well. There has to be good communication paths in place. There has to be an understanding between the two on how we effectively manage risk together as a portfolio. Now, that could go to the idea too of checking or doing health checks on your supply chain risk management program. And by the way, I use program specifically. This is a programmatic discussion, right? We need to be assessing our suppliers. And you see this actually with the federal government, where they're within the Department of Defense looking at things like CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model for their supply base to make sure that their CUI or their critical unclassified information is not going to be shared readily, that it's going to be protected, that there's a reduction in risk exposure. So you have to get an understanding. How mature are my suppliers? What kind of controls do they have in place that they're radiating back up to me that level of assurance that they're doing the right thing? There are other ways to do this too. As much as I've been talking about the expectation of having suppliers on board and knowing who I have in my current portfolio, it goes without saying too that some organizations should be looking on that far horizon. You want to avoid having that sole source provider that you're hinging your organization and its critical delivery upon. So you are constantly looking for more suppliers for your supply base to make sure that you have a diverse selection of folks that you can turn to in case that cold, dark day comes. And then you'll hear other things. You'll hear about software bills and materials and other smaller type items that need to be in place. But the big picture is having controls in place to establish trust with your providers and to know that they are meeting your expectations.
So you mentioned SBOM there, and I know we did a webcast a couple months ago on the acquisition side of it. Is that what you're referring to, Brett? Like,
yeah,
what the implication there? And you hear about it in the media and the community now. Can you dive a little bit deeper into what exactly software bill of materials is and why that's important from a risk side?
Sure. So I mentioned the term controls, and there are many that we could have in place, and there are many tools that we could have in place to help us. So I don't want to make it sound like SBOM is the one thing that could help, but it is very helpful. Imagine if I were baking a cake, if you will, okay, and I gave you a list of the ingredients, everything I had. This is no different than if I were procuring software or something to that effect. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to be software. It could be maybe a piece of hardware. Maybe it's a set or a stack of cabinets with equipment in it. Maybe it has to do with our operations. Or maybe even vulnerability exposure, any of those. So this software bill of materials starts to dial in and document the ingredients that are necessary to make that product go. And kind of like at a high level, right? But it goes to another layer down. And actually, I should give credit to, there's the National Telecommunications Information Administration, NTIA, who's been doing a lot of work here to help forge with the community what a good software bill of materials looks like. And there are several standards that have spawned from this. There's the Software Package Exchange. I think they're like on version 2.3, I want to say. There's Cyclone DX, and there's software information, software identity tags, SWID they call it. All these different standards have a different perspective or a different take on how to properly document those ingredients and the pieces of those ingredients too. It's not just the idea that I throw flour right into a cake. Excuse me, that flour may have, maybe it's bleach flour, maybe it's enriched, maybe it has something in it that I need to know more about. And there comes like one of the classic questions as to how deep do you dive into understanding the ingredients in said cake in this example, right? And not only that, there's this question too: if I knew everything, if I had a software bill of materials that was so perfect that it would even give me a line by line of who authored each piece of code in said package or product, can I afford to go and remedy every challenge in there? Can I afford to monitor every single line, to vet every single author? And the answer, I think, for most organizations would be no. I mean, that's it's going to be unrealistic to do so. So there's this challenge, a balance that needs to be struck. Just because I have a knowledge of everything that is in said cake, how far or how much can I invest to reduce my risk exposures that's within an acceptable level of appetite for my organization?
Great answer. I was just going to go there with cost, and you kind of answered it already. Of like, you can't vet everything, but how about time? How long is it the time to implement one of these programs? If you're a small organization or someone getting started, and I know it's an impossible answer, but what is your answer to something?
Yeah, and I don't have any one good heuristic, but I have some things to consider. If you're going to put a program like this in place, this is going to be very much, and regardless of the size of the organization, regardless of how many resources you bring to the table, regardless of how many vendors you may have in your portfolio, this is very much a marathon, not a sprint. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that when you build a supply chain risk management program, that you're getting into a long game. There's going to be really no end. As long as you have providers that are coming to the table, which I don't foresee a world, given how interconnected we are, that you're going to have an organization that's going to be perfectly able to abstain from having some kind of providers, then you're going to want to have a program in place. And I already gave you the fundamental pillars that you may want to consider here, much like any risk management program. Governance, first of all. Who's making the decisions? How are they making the decisions? Are they risk-based? Is a great place to start. And they have to have an understanding of the appetite. Like, in other words, what kind of risks are we willing to bring on given these providers? What is the value return? What is the return on risk investment we're looking for given the exposure we may have in the supply chain? And I'm not just talking about your immediate suppliers, but remember, we're also talking about that nth tier because they're reliant upon providers as well. And then somehow you need to document this. You know, I like to say, like, when you have an organizational policy, this is the idea that will people really do anything if it's not properly written down? And if it is written down, it has to be very explicit and tell people what the expectations are for that organization. So that policy is kind of like the touchstone or the bedrock where the organization documents what's expected. This may come down to, as a good example, a templated set of terms and conditions that is to be used at least as a starting point when speaking with new providers or even ones that you have in place today. And that brings me to one more point. As I'm talking about the supply chain risk management program, I want to acknowledge the idea that it is a team sport. Remember when we talked about the CIO, CISO, CRO? That was like the team sport in the executive suite, right? But then you also have a chief procurement officer or somebody who's in the logistics supply chain. You have people who are in the consumer side of it, where you actually have the people who need the products that are being purchased. They come to the table with their requirements. You have security requirements that are going to be in place. You're going to have a lot of contractual considerations. That brings a legal team. So I think that one final element that's really key here is the team sport idea. Never do anything in that black, dark closet on your own kind of an idea.
Right. Great answer. Thank you for that, Brett. So obviously being a part of CERT, I know operational resilience is a big part of the portfolio within the division there. Can you take us down, some of how you can build resilience into an organization, talk about some of the models that are available and what are some of the key steps there?
Yeah, well, so I'm going to be biased here for a moment. We do have CERT RMM, and that's our resilience management model. And I think it's a great place to start in a sense because we have such a broad number of pillars that we use, or we have about 26 or so in place that you can key upon. But undeniably, there are so many other great things out there to hinge upon. So let's start with the first notion of why resilience. Like I said from the very beginning, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And then once you hear that a supplier has been impacted and it is going to ripple up that chain and it's going to impact you, you're immediately moving to that, okay, it's now mode, right? And you're trying to think about like, okay, so how do we respond to this? Are there other suppliers that we have? Has the incident that has taken place, is it going to have impact on us directly? Maybe they have a hack or something that has happened that finds its way into our system. So what are we doing to make sure that we're insulating ourselves from our own allies, if you will? And the idea there too is recovery, because now that you're in that situation, you are now party to maybe losing a critical service because your vendor has lost that same ability to deliver for you. So do you have backups? Are there other contingencies in place to keep maybe a backlog of inventory if you're talking about material? Maybe it's alternative business processes that you have in place. Maybe they just are slower or they are a little bit more costly. But the whole idea is to get your organization back up and running, to get through that disaster phase and get into that business continuity phase, and understanding the depth and level of impact that supplier has brought to you with their incident. Now, one other thought here too, in terms of being resilient. What if you're impacted? Then you start thinking about, what are my suppliers thinking? Oh my goodness, it could ripple back down to them. They may actually be doing the whole clam shell or like turtle, where they're hiding to make sure that they're not going to get polluted by what has impacted us. So this is a two-way street. I don't want to make it sound like it's just the parent organization that's beating up on its suppliers to make sure they're doing the right thing. This communication path has to be both ways. And I think that is another good point to this whole resilience piece. Communication is key. Making sure that those paths are open, that they're honest, and that there's this discussion, a trustworthy based discussion of what are capabilities, what are the weaknesses that we have, and how can we avoid that cold, dark day? And if it comes, how can we be prepared?
And does the model have metrics to how organizations are doing in implementing this, or how they measure up against other organizations?
That's a great question. And there are classic cybersecurity based metrics that we've used to understand organizational performance in that cold, dark day moment. I'm going to go with that first discussion first. Like we talk about return point to operations, RTO, RPO, where we're talking about what's the amount of time that an organization can be down. And if it's down for too long, we are going to suffer some permanent disability for the organization. So we can test to that. We can put tabletop exercises together. We can run scenarios against folks to understand if they can recover before that RTO point is hit. There's also this notion of maybe I have a certain amount of information that I have provided and shared with certain members of my supply chain. And is there a point where they've lost so much of that information that it has now lost its confidentiality and integrity that once again, we won't be able to recover? We won't be able to, I classically think of maybe a bank or maybe healthcare where you lose so many patient records. Is it to a point where I've lost so much that I really have no ability to keep my shingle hanging out on my doorstep to say that I'm still in business? And once again, this goes back to the idea, well, how can I test that supply chain? Is there some kind of sensitivity analysis or stress test that I can put to them to understand the levers, the pieces that I can move to make them feel pressure, to understand like how responsive they are, how resilient are they in getting back in the game for me? A lot of that is cascaded down into organizations via terms and conditions and service level agreements. But I would argue that once again, this is a case where it goes beyond the contractual piece, where you have to have that relationship built with those providers to make sure that they're doing the right thing for you, that due diligence piece.
Question from the chat asking, does CMU have any guidelines or templates available for constructing their own supply chain inventories of a software product?
Oh, okay. So that sounds somewhat like a SBOM to me. We have publications that talk about software bills of materials, and we talk about the application of them. And I'll tell you what, subsequent to this, we can post some for the community to look at. We do not go with any specific standard outside the ones that I mentioned, because let's face it, as a community, we're trying to settle upon whether it's the SPDX, the Cyclone DX or SWID or anything like that. Rather, we have a lot of our research portfolio focused on how to properly apply and utilize those. A good example here would be application to, say, open source software. So, and boy, by the way, this is opening a whole new can of worms. It's probably going off the beaten path for what your person asking the question was even looking for. But it's like thinking about SBOM in a novel way as to how do we know where risk exposure is with open source software. This is software that you would just go download for free, maybe from a GitHub or another site, and load it into an application or something that I'm purchasing or procuring. How do I know that that software is being maintained properly? If it's a black box and has anyone looked at it to understand if there's any kind of malicious code or anything like that in it? An SBOM could be a very handy tool to help you at least identify and know that you have that exposure there, let alone how to address it. So to answer your question, we are looking at ways we can leverage SBOMs better in our research.
So we know you're hosting an in-person event in February, Brent, on supply chain risk management. Can you talk a little bit about, or do you have some speakers lined up or speaking opportunities available at the one-day workshop in Arlington? What can you tell us about that?
Both, yes. Thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
So we're looking for doing a supply chain risk management symposium on February 28th. It is going to be in the DC area. Actually, it's going to be in Arlington at our facility, SCI facility there. It's going to be a conference of about 150 or so professionals, both public and private sector. Yes, we do have some exciting speakers coming on board, senior executive service level folks from the federal government. We're also looking at CEO and C-suite level folks who are from private industry who are going to be coming in. And yes, there are still spots available for speaking. And I am going to be putting out a cattle call over the next few months, not only for speakers, but also to see if we can generate interest subsequent to this webcast to bring people on board and to build this community of interest to talk about not just SBOM, but just so many of these other issues that we've alluded to today with proper application. And what are other aspects that we need to think about to insulate our supply base?
So you gave a lot of good advice there about some of the products or models available from CERT, Brett. What other models or regulations can you talk about? Where can from people find some other information, government provided, other industry related? Where would you point them to?
Yeah, so the good news here is there's never a lack of information. As a matter of fact, if anything, it's an information overflow. And it's a good idea to not only familiarize yourself with all of it, but the hard part is understanding what pieces apply to you given your regulatory environment. So a good start, especially if you're within the United States and you're working maybe in both public and private or private sectors. NIST has a whole lot of good things out there. Start with NIST SP 800 161 comes to mind. Maybe if you're talking about expected control sets, you also have SP 853 and 171. That discussion of what controls are necessary for the defense industrial base and protection of CUI as it relates to controlled and classified information, that became a distillant in control sets to this SP 800 171. And then the DoD took another step forward and said, hey, no, we need a way to better measure the maturity of organizations in terms of how they're applying said controls, and that brought about CMMC. So that would be another great place to look at the DoD CIO's office to understand the requirements of CMMC. There are a lot of executive orders and a lot of neat things coming across from this administration. I got to give credit to our government. They have a lot of great direction coming out. On another one, first and foremost comes to mind is the software bills and materials. Again, we have Executive Order 14028 that came out. It's talking a lot about software supply chain security. I think that's another great source. Even more recently, you see the federal government is looking for more and more information too. There was a open source software request for information that's going to be due to the Office of the National Cyber Director November 8th. So if anyone's interested, you should look there to voice your opinion and to help the government understand where we as a community see prioritization for different issues at hand for open source software.
Great, thanks for that. Robert chimed in about the February event, asking if an email blast will be sent out notifying people. And yeah, we will, to anybody that registered for today's event, we'll make sure there's a link in our follow-up email that will take you to the event on how to register, how to make a plan to try to be a speaker, or we'll get you in touch with Brett for those logistics as well. So, Brett, you mentioned earlier about it being almost inevitable that companies are going to run into problems or, hacks or whatever. So what's your best piece of advice? Where is ground zero? Where do they start to prevent these, or what's the recovery part? What's your best one piece of advice without, where did we start?
Man, that's such a great question. You have to the idea is no one silver bullet. So you're having me stripped down to just that one. And I would say if feet held to the fire in today's day and age, I think that governance is the most important place to start. Remember, this goes back to the idea of who's making the decisions, how are those risk-based decisions being made? Because let's face it, if you have a whole group of people and they're out making their own decisions, they're making their own risk decisions, an organization loses control of that idea of even how much risk exposure they have, right? So you have to have, and I said it at the very beginning of the discussion, I'll say it again, this tone at the top that is set in an organization to say, hey, here are the expectations we have. Yes, go do great things, but if you need vendors, you need to follow policy and make sure that they are meeting our intent of having due care and due diligence for our customer base, for the services that we're delivering. And if you go and you procure a product, whether it's software, and no matter how small it may be, if that is the weak link that brings an organization to its knees, you've kind of lost the game, right? The only way you can stop this is by starting at the very top and impressing upon the organization that this is an issue that does matter. A program must be resourced, it must be fueled, and there must be this level and degree of advocacy to tell the others in the organization that they shall belly to the bar and set fair expectation across their supply base.
What about official guidance? Someone just asked, has the CMU published any governance guidelines concerning SCRM? Is there
specifically for supply chain risk management, not yet, but we are working on this idea. I would like to say that we have published a lot of guidance on properly structuring governance in an organization. I think about Octave Forte, for example, which is an enterprise risk management based framework that talks about how organizations should establish proper governance. Whether you're talking about supply chain risk, whether you're talking about cyber risk or any risk in general in an organization, the trick with supply chain risk is that you don't do anything different. So to say that we haven't necessarily published on supply chain risk is actually not exact, because we've published a lot of discussion on governance. You should use that same vehicle for supply chain as much as using it for other modalities of risk that you have in your organization. So I'll lead you with Octave Forte is a good place to start. You can Google that. You can also look to CERT RMM for what are the activities that we're doing to insulate our organization and make them more resilient. And there are other products that we've done with respect to how to properly structure a CISO organization that we can provide here subsequent to this discussion.
So I know the answer to this question already, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Tools, can you recommend tools for SCRM?
So once again, this is the notion that there are tools out there that are maybe at the face of it agnostic of supply chain, but can be leveraged all the same. I like to think about, as a matter of fact, I'll go back again to Octave Forte toolset, where you have enterprise risk management based tools on how to properly dissect risks, how to look at them in terms of what are the impacts of the organization, both quantitatively and qualitatively. That process doesn't necessarily change. Just because the vector may be coming in through your supply chain, you could be using those. And that may even dial back to like, there are other tools, FAIR comes to mind, Octave Allegro comes to mind, where you have like the tools that are being used in the front lines or in the trenches, if you will, with cyber professionals. And they're looking every day at, hey, I have a hack that can come into my organization. What's that mean in terms of impact? Where does that match my risk appetite? And further to that, like, how can I insulate or protect myself? So it gets this idea of making good risk-based decisions on control selection. So you'll find those within, the Octave tool set. Like I said, I mentioned FAIR, which is a more rigorous quantitative take on that, but should have the same result: selection of good controls, making good control selection so you have a good return on risk investment, I guess, is what I'm looking for in that answer as well.
Great. Any other comments, Brett? Anything else you're working on that you want to highlight? Is your directorate or program hiring? Anything you want to close this off with here before I send this?
Great question. Yes, always looking to hire, always looking for great professionals. I am very much looking for quantitative approaches and understanding what risk exposure is in organizations. And once again, transcends the idea of supply chain. It could be from any specific source. Very interested in looking at complexity of organizations, complexity of networks, to understand mathematically how that would impact the ability of an organization to operate properly, how to measure control efficacy. So once again, I put controls in place to look at my supply chain. How do I know, or how do I properly measure the fact that they are doing what they say they're doing? And how do I know that that performance is something that I can place my trust in? So looking to put formal methodology or math behind that is a good starting point. So anyone who has interest in that, please step up, and I'd love to either partner with you in terms of research, or if you're looking for opportunities within the organization, I'd love to talk to you there as well.
Right. Great discussion, Dave. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And we'd like to thank you all for attending today. Upon exiting, please hit the like button below and below the video window and share the archive if you found value. Also, you can subscribe to the SEI's YouTube channel by clicking on the SEI seal in the lower right corner of the video window. We do invite you to join us for the Supply Chain Risk Management Symposium 2024 on February 28th in Arlington, Virginia. Registration information is available on our website now and will be emailed out as well. Any questions from today's event, please send to info@sei.cmu.edu. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.